Hey there friends, I'm talking about toxic labs. And in this video, I want to make sure that you recognize a toxic lab and a bad actor, PI, before you get yourself in a situation of working in a place like that. So what can you do to spot a toxic lab? The first point where you can find out if a lab is toxic is of course during the interview. Even though very often this is going to be not conclusive, because during an interview people are generally on their best behavior. And therefore it can be tricky to get a really good sense of the lab and the PI. But here are some pointers. Maybe the person interviewing you turns out to be more interested in themselves and is not so interested in the answers that you provide or the questions you have. If they're dismissive of your questions, that can be a potential red flag. Maybe they cut you off when you're in the middle of your answer or display other rude behavior. Maybe also some of the interactions among the review panel are somewhat awkward. Can you spot if they appear to be comfortable with each other? Are they relaxed? You can sometimes watch the body language and get a good sense of that during the interview. Or maybe you're just getting some bad vibes from this interaction that are very difficult to pinpoint. And if you do, I think you should trust yourself. After the interview, there's also many other things that you can do. For example, very often there will be a follow-up meeting, either in person or online, and that is actually going to be a very crucial opportunity to find out more about this lab and the PI. Here are some things that you can do. For example, ask to meet separately with some of the lab members. Now, if there's any hesitation about that, then this can already be a bad sign. You could ask questions about lab routines, like for example, do they have a journal club or do they meet regularly someplace? You could ask how they handle conflict resolution. You could directly ask what the lab community is like and how the PI or other people foster a healthy lab environment. You could ask the PI how they would describe themselves as a mentor or a supervisor. I think this is a good question to ask, because a good person would probably also say at some point, maybe I shouldn't just be describing myself, but you should talk to the actual people concerned. So if you don't want to ask directly if you can meet with other lab members, this can be sort of the lead-in to them inviting you to talk to other lab members. Ask the PI to describe their commitment to the career development of their PhD students and postdocs, to see what they come up with. You could ask about time management, like you could ask about working times, what are some of the expectations there, what about holiday times, times off, what's the general attitude. You could ask lab members or the PI what is there to do during time off and see how they react to that question. Because maybe they don't want you to have any time off. And do they appreciate that this is also an important aspect of your decision? You could ask lab members what don't they like about this lab. I think this is a good question because if you see them hesitating, then this can tell you a number of different things depending on the response. And in a good lab, they will probably struggle to come up with anything. And I think those are some very good questions to ask during these follow-up meetings. If you can, the best thing to do is actually to do a visit to this lab. Like if the lab is generally within reach, so not exactly on another continent, can you go there and spend a couple of days there? Do like an internship, for example. And even better, if you think ahead of maybe during your PhD, what lab would you like to do a postdoc in, you can do these internships then and really work in this lab for maybe a couple of weeks or a month or something as part of your research, and then you can really get to know a lab. Because these are really the best, because when you're there, I think you will get a very good sense of what's going on. Another thing that you can do to gather information is to ask colleagues or your current PI. This is good because it might be actually quite well known who are some of the bad actors, or where there is at least a suspicion that not everything is going as smoothly in these labs, or that maybe they're kind of cutthroat in terms of internal competition. So I think that your PI or other trusted colleagues may actually have a good sense sometimes of where some bad actors are. Of course, you should keep in mind that your PI may like somebody, but they will turn out to still be an awful person in running the lab. And conversely, your PI may actually not like somebody, but in fact, they are a great PI to the people that are there. Now, very likely your PI will not only know the other PI, but they will also know some of the people in the lab, especially if the labs are very close. And I think then it's much more reliable information. Now, another group of people that you can ask are, of course, current or former members of that potential host lab. But of course, asking current people in the lab can be tricky because they may either be too afraid to talk to you openly, or they may actually be complicit in the bad behavior that's ongoing in the lab. So that's always tricky. So what may be actually better is to ask some former members of the lab. They may be a more reliable source of information. Also, if you can, and if the opportunity arises, you could ask some people from the lab next door, because they will have no stake in what's going on, typically. They at least will not be afraid to say anything, but they typically know what's going on in the lab next door. And of course, it also depends a little bit on how you ask things. So for example, you could ask like, how collaborative is the lab? Or how accessible is the PI to people in your status group? For example, if you're a PhD student or a postdoc. Or you can ask, can the PI admit if they're wrong? So I think that there are fairly innocuous questions that you can think about that then, are not as direct as, is this guy a jerk, basically? Which of course would not be a good thing to ask because it puts people on the spot. However, if somebody comes out and says this person is a jerk, you should really believe it. Now, of course, a toxic PI is being perceived differently by different people. So some behavior that you will consider toxic may not be for others, and vice versa. So I think, these interactions are always to be taken with a grain of salt because they're people's opinion based on their experience of this person. But I think if you get a couple of them, you get the picture. And now finally, what you can also do is your own research. By all means, go to the lab webpage you have anyway in preparation for the interview, but now look at the publications. Are PhD students and postdocs also first authors, for example? Are there many collaborative papers? Are there papers with other groups in the same department, institute, or university? Those can be also potential hints at what's going on in that group. If you go through the lab webpage, are there resources posted or at least internally available about mentorship or about professional guidance? Are there notes about mentoring? Are there descriptions of lab culture? Or also like supervision agreements? Those can also be potentially good signs in terms of that the PI cares enough about that to include documents to that effect on the webpage. Now, a final thing you can do is if you can get a hold of some of the theses coming out of this lab, PhD or master's thesis, it might be revealing to look at some of the acknowledgements. Are they all kind of boilerplate and standard, or do they feel like heartfelt in some of the cases? Are they generic, or do they appear to be from the heart? I think that can also be a final piece of the puzzle. Now, I think if you pursue all these routes to collect information about a future lab and a PI, I think you have done everything you can. And I think it is very important that you do, because you do not want to end up in a situation like that. So it is well worth the effort to do ahead of time. Now, it may still be possible that you encounter unsupportive behavior once you're there, for example, by some lab members, senior lab members, or also your peers. But at least you have done everything you could to avoid being in a lab where the PI is a bad actor, because that is very, very difficult to deal with in the long run. So I hope you found this collection of thoughts and pieces of advice useful. And I hope that you will exercise due diligence in picking your supervisor or mentor for your PhD and your postdoc. I was just lucky. I didn't do any of this. When I started my PhD, I showed up with a bunch of suitcases. I'd never met the person, never talked to the guy. I was just lucky. But I think you should definitely do better than that. And I hope this video was giving you some good hints on what you can do. And with that, thanks for watching, good luck, and see you in the next video. Bye.